today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you how I became a fan of professional wrestling and the WWE. I'm also going to be sharing a bunch of your stories because I asked you what wrestler, match, promo, storyline, game made you fall in love with the world of WWE and pro wrestling in general. This is also my last day of traveling here at TwitchCon San Diego, so say goodbye to the hotel room that makes it look like this is a hostage video. We're going to go back to our good audio and our good lighting. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, ring the bell for notifications. If you're a wrestling fan, you're going to fall in love with his YouTube channel because we always upload daily wrestling content. Clearly, as you can see, even when traveling, you still get your fill of wrestling videos. All right, let's jump into it. Let's start off first by telling you a little bit about my experience when I first started falling in love with professional wrestling. And I think that it's worth talking about 2 points of my life because I've had to fall in love with wrestling twice. Once in 2002 when I first discovered wrestling, and again in 2011 because I had actually fallen out of love with wrestling altogether. Back in 2002, I found wrestling by luck, just channel surfing, and I feel like probably many of you fall within that same category. I didn't have an older brother or anyone that introduced me into wrestling. It literally was just stumbling upon a random episode of Thursday Night Smackdown as it was back then. I did have a tiny little bit of experience with wrestling prior to 2002 with wrestling video games, which I do think were a major part in making me fall in love with wrestling even more as well. But really, my true core beginning of love for wrestling starts in 2002 with the storyline between The Rock and Brock Lesnar and Triple H and Shawn Michaels going into SummerSlam 2002. I would say, yes, they are both fantastic storylines and they culminated in amazing matches, but I think the reason I fell in love with wrestling because of these feuds was because these were the first two major feuds that I was following from the very beginning to the very end. Because prior to these two storylines, I had really just been getting the back end of the Attitude Era, the ending of other storylines. Meanwhile, I got to see the beginning, well, kind of the beginning of Triple H and Shawn Michaels, because obviously they had history in the 90s, but I got to see like the return of Shawn Michaels and the betrayal of Shawn Michaels, and I got to see Brock Lesnar win King of the Ring, challenge The Rock, become the youngest undisputed champion. Like, I got to see it from the start all the way to the finish. And I felt like both the matches and the storylines were just so freaking hype. The video packages leading into their matches at SummerSlam to this day are still stuck in my head. I remember the music from those hype packages. And I was just enthralled with professional wrestling from there on. I bought every single video game. I bought as many VHSs and DVDs as I possibly could. I would try and find wrestling magazines. Anything that was related to professional wrestling, I wanted to get my hands on. Now, I did fall out of wrestling in 2007, and it coincided with me starting high school, and I think part of the reason was perhaps me being a bit self-conscious about being a professional wrestling fan at a time where it really was kind of nerdy and not cool to be a wrestling fan, sadly. And I kind of gave in to peer pressure because I had friends that already kind of laughed at me for being a professional wrestling fan. So entering into high school, you know, like really important social years, I gave it up, which I entirely regret. Now, when I entered college in 2011, I refound wrestling again when The Rock came back to host WrestleMania 27. Unfortunately, when I came back, wrestling wasn't very good. Most of the stuff that I was seeing in the superstars that were on screen were people that I either really didn't relate to or I just didn't find the storylines and the matches very good. And I was this close to just foregoing wrestling altogether and saying, okay, clearly I aged out of it and this is not for me anymore. Luckily, there was a gentleman by the name of CM Punk that would cut one of the most legendary, groundbreaking, fourth wall destroying promos, a promo that to this day is considered one of the greatest promos in professional wrestling history, a promo that I felt reached through the screen, grabbed me by the neck, and demanded that I stay a wrestling fan. And I did. I continued to give it another shot, and I got to experience Money in the Bank 2011, CM Punk versus John Cena, and the entirety of the Summer of Punk. So that to me is the second time that I found and fell in love with wrestling again. CM Punk in 2011. 2011. This is why I'm always just so sentimental about the topic of CM Punk, because genuinely, I am not here in this hotel room with this garbage lighting if it's not for CM Punk. And the beauty about professional wrestling is that it's constantly going. It doesn't stop, which means that different people find and fall in love with wrestling at different moments because of different WWE superstars, because of different matches, because of different reasons altogether. So I want to hear yours now. Samir says Punk's pipe bomb. And I feel like there's a lot of people that are in that category like me. The CM Punk pipe bomb was just so damn good. It demanded your attention. It changed what we had expected to expect from the world of professional wrestling. Like, this to me is one of the most important moments in professional wrestling history. So I'm not surprised that a bunch of you submitted this, because this truly was just a gripping moment in professional wrestling. Carter says NXT Black and Gold. See, this is fascinating because a lot of people at this time, the best and really one of the only viable options of watching professional wrestling is the WWE. Like, New Japan at this point is still mostly just big outside of the United States, and it hasn't quite found its popularity on this side of the world yet. So if you wanted like a true alternative to WWE that wasn't Impact, then NXT was the next best thing. And interestingly enough, the 2010s is such a bad time, like from beginning to end for professional wrestling. Obviously, there's some really good stuff in there, that if you started with NXT Black and Gold instead of the main roster, I could totally understand why you fell in love with professional wrestling, because that era of wrestling through the NXT system was perfection. Joshua says Orton versus Triple H versus the McMahon family. I don't really have a lot to say about this because, as I mentioned, I fell out of love from professional wrestling from 2007 to 2011, and this happened in that era. Of course, I've since gone back and I've seen the clips, I've seen the matches, but because I wasn't there, I can't really speak from like that really emotional standpoint as to like what I think about this and why it would grip me as a wrestling fan. But when you just look at the names and the wrestlers that are involved in this storyline, I could absolutely understand why this is a storyline that absolutely captivated people's minds and souls. Once in a lifetime, Cena versus Rock, WrestleMania 28. I actually know a lot of people that this is where they started watching professional wrestling, because that's the power of The Rock. Like, The Rock at this point is already the biggest blockbuster movie star in the world. So The Rock making that leap back to professional wrestling brought a lot of people that had never experienced professional wrestling before until this night. John Cena versus The Rock. Like, The Rock just has that kind of pull, man, to bring entirely new demographics and an entire new population of wrestling fans into the product. I remember that watching this at a movie theater, bringing my then girlfriend at the time, who was also fascinated by the idea of The Rock being there. She didn't end up sticking with wrestling, or with me for that matter. Assassin says Team Cena versus Team Authority. This to me is one of the gems of the 2010s, because there is a lot of bad in the 2010s, folks, but this is absolutely not one of them. This is one of the best built Survivor Series matches, one of the best executed Survivor Series matches, and one of the best Survivor Series matches endings ever. The match, the story, the twist, I can absolutely see why if somebody encounters wrestling at this point, or if this is one of like their big early pay-per-views as they were called back then I could absolutely see why you would watch that and stick with professional wrestling for the rest of your life, because this is one of the best things to come out of wrestling in the 2010s. Edge and Kane's 2010 feud. This is easily one of my earliest memories of watching Wrestling Weekly, and I easily fell in love. Edge, the face, torturing Kane, the heel, for what seemed like months. This made Edge my first favorite in WWE and wrestling as a whole. I'm so glad that I asked this question, because people are submitting things that I just like would have never thought of. To me, this feud is like a repressed memory. Obviously, I wasn't watching wrestling back then, so I don't have that firsthand account, but I've gone back and watched most of the major things from this era, and I don't fucking recall this. But again, this is the beauty. Everyone has their different jumping in points that made them fall in love with wrestling, and this is Prince's. Harry Richard says, the feud between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, the storyline, the matches, everything was perfect. It's funny because I bet that you could find people that started watching wrestling in the Attitude Era that might give the same answer, just from a different decade and a different era of professional wrestling altogether. It's kind of crazy that we got this feud being such a big marquee feud for the WWE twice in different generations altogether. But yeah, you're kind of spoiled. If this was really like your juncture point of becoming a wrestling fan, like, of course you're gonna become a goddamn wrestling fan if you're watching one of the best stories, one of the best feuds between two of the greatest of all time. Jack says, the beer truck. I started watching in 1996 with my dad and saw the rise of Austin and The Rock and always loved their rivalry. They were my 1A and 1B of pro wrestling growing up. Second closest is Daniel Bryan's Yeselmania run in WrestleMania 30 reignited a lost love when I was much older. It seems like you have a type of wrestling story feud in general, which is the guy that sticks it to the boss, the guy that shouldn't be the guy becoming undeniable and stealing being the guy from the person that's preventing him from being the guy. I wasn't watching wrestling at the height of the Attitude Era, so I miss when the beer bath happened live on TV, but this is one of those moments that like has lived and stood the test of time in just about every single pro wrestling documentary or any single history of WrestleMania or history of WWE video package or documentary. It's going to have this moment. I actually like envy people that grew up or were watching wrestling in the Attitude Era. Like, I really want to know what that experience was like, because I'll never really have that. I'll never know what it was like to have two top of the line wrestling companies that were literally fighting for number one, because right now the WWE in terms of a business is just so much further ahead of everybody. Maybe one day we get AEW getting to the point where it's really challenging the WWE for that number one spot, but as of now, like, I don't know if we'll ever experience that rivalry of WCW and WWE again. Sean Talks Wrestling says, started watching more seriously during the New Generation era, and the Shawn and Brett feud is what really drew me in. Strong personalities, stronger matches, and some great storytelling, both in and out of the ring. This is an era of wrestling that gets a lot of hate from people because, admittedly, there's a lot that isn't very good, but the not very good is absolutely not Brett and Shawn. Funnily enough, because I've been doing the match club on Patreon, I've been exposing myself to a lot more of these matches from this generation. I've recently discovered that I adore Bret Hart and Bret Hart matches and 90s Shawn Michaels. These guys are obviously amazing, and I knew that they were amazing, but now they're on the forefront of my brain, and I want to evangelize and tell everybody how amazing their matches with anybody really were. Anybody that was watching wrestling at this time that I know, their favorite wrestler is Shawn and it is Brett, so I can only imagine when these two came together that it was just magic for your eyes. I had fallen out of love with wrestling, but decided to check out TNA in 2007. Samoa Joe versus Kurt Angle at Hard Justice made me fall in love with the art of wrestling. This is so cool because there is the people like me that have fallen out of love with WWE only to come back to the WWE. And then there's people like you that fell out of love with WWE and found their love for wrestling somewhere else that wasn't WWE. And we're seeing that happen a lot, especially in the 2020s and late 2010s, with WWE fans saying this is just not it and heading over to AEW and refinding their love for pro wrestling there. This is actually a fundamentally fantastic example as to why we need good competition in the landscape of professional wrestling, whether it's mainstream companies, foreign companies, indie companies, whatever it might be. Not only is it good for the wrestlers, but it's also good for the fans that don't like a particular product, but can still find a love for professional wrestling somewhere else that's providing a different taste of it. Gio DeFio says, this is the story that got me into wrestling, referencing the Sami Zayn Zayn saga with the Bloodline. So we know that today the Bloodline narrative, the saga that is the Bloodline, is considered maybe the greatest professional wrestling story of all time. But within that long, damn near now 5-year storyline of the Bloodline, I would say that the 7-month arc of the honorary Sami Zayn climbing up all the way to the ranks of the Bloodline is the best part of the best saga in all of professional wrestling. It was magical seeing the rise of Sami Zayn, seeing that moment at the Royal Rumble, seeing him win the trust of the Bloodline at Survivor Series War Games, getting that opportunity in front of his wife in his hometown in Montreal at Elimination Chamber, leading into the amazing main event night 1 of WrestleMania tag match against the Usos with Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. It was perfect, right down to the last minute detail. The Edge versus Cena rivalry of 2006. As a little kid, I watched some wrestling here and there, but their good guy / bad guy dynamic had me hooked into their segments, promos, matches each and every week. I think you're in a similar boat to me. You found a rivalry when you started watching wrestling, and that rivalry itself, everything that encapsulates the rivalry, got its hooks into you, and you fell in love with it, and you got to watch the ride from beginning to end. And what a ride Cena and Edge was from the inception of the Money in the Bank, him cashing in on Cena at New Year's Revolution, the one night stand stuff that happened, and of course the build up to their insane TLC match at Unforgiven, their stuff at SummerSlam. Really, like, this is to me Cena's best individual, like, good guy, bad guy rivalry. The Dark Boy says that for me, it was any Usos versus New Day match. They legitimately tried to be the highlight during the Vince era. For everything that was wrong in the 2015 to 2020 region of professional wrestling, the New Day and the Usos was not it. He is right. Like, they were the highlight of professional wrestling, and they were routinely the highlight of every single WWE pay-per-view. Like, the feud between the Usos and the New Day, from the matches to the promos to the rap battle, was just unbelievably good. Undertaker versus Mankind, Hell in a Cell, the first ever WWE match I've ever watched. God damn, that's the first match you ever watched? That was some goddamn trial by fire, my friend. Of course you became a wrestling fan if that's your first match ever. That thing was amazing. It was a car crash that how are you not traumatized after that? For me, it wasn't even that. It was playing Smackdown versus Raw 2011 with my cousin. That game sparked the love I have for wrestling now. Yeah, I had a little bit of this as well with my neighbor playing some WWF No Mercy, WWF Warzone, and some of the WCW games. Like, I had some experience with wrestlers prior to, like, really discovering professional wrestling and when it was on a weekly basis. So I totally get where you're coming from. Like, the games is such a great, underrated jumping off point for professional wrestling fandom. Darby Allin's Ninth Life says, the entirety of the King Booker storyline. The utilization of Charmel was perfect. The entire King gimmick, accent, court with Regal and Finlay was spot on for me. And incorporating Angle in the last years around that time just worked. This was not on my bingo card. The mention of King Booker is awesome, but just again, it's just kind of crazy. Everybody has their different tastes. Everybody has the different thing that just it captivates them as wrestling fans. I never thought I'd find somebody that for them it was King Booker. Was always a fan of wrestling, but when my friends showed me Daniels versus Styles versus Joe at Unbreakable 2005, it definitely elevated my love for wrestling. This is actually a really interesting point to talk about. It doesn't just have to be falling in love with wrestling for the first time. There are people, and I bet you a lot of you here that are watching fall in the boat where something made you an even bigger wrestling fan to the point where you watch wrestling YouTubers and you follow wrestling to a T. And I could totally see this being a match that does that for people because it really highlighted that amazing wrestling happens in other places aside from WWE. So if I was a WWE fan and I'm introduced to this unbelievably perfect match, by the way, somewhere else that isn't WWE, all of a sudden I'm asking, well, what else is happening all over the world? Where else can I find these unbelievably good matches outside of the WWE? And then all of a sudden that becomes a rabbit hole to the point where now all of a sudden you're watching Santi Zab talk about wrestling memories and why you fell in love with professional wrestling out of a hotel room. I was watching Raw and Smackdown weekly as a kid. Then my mom got me a Best Ladder Matches CD, and it had this match, and I really fell in love with the WWE, referencing the ladder match between Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon at WrestleMania 10. Bro, these extra bonus content DVD compilations or DVDs or VHSs of different or like older WWE shows is such a great way to get into wrestling. See, I found wrestling through channel surfing, but I had already seen wrestling shows by renting out WWE and WWF VHSs from public libraries. So I already had a little bit of experience with watching older WWE shows, but it's access to these types of things that really does make it easier not just to fall in love with wrestling, but to learn the history of professional wrestling. And it's easier now than ever before because you have an entire video package available on the WWE network. There were times in my era where you had to find the DVDs and the VHSs at local libraries. There were times before that where people were trading VHS tapes of professional wrestling that they had taped over the years. Like, that was an actual culture amongst wrestling fans to trade tapes. I'm a new wrestling fan, and I started watching at this year's Royal Rumble. With that being said, the first major storyline that I fell in love with was Punk, Drew, and Rollins, and that shit is absolute cinema, especially the feud surviving with Drew being the only one on TV. Yeah, there's people that are getting into wrestling today, and interestingly enough, like if I look at the landscape of wrestling as it is right now, I feel like if there is a feud to create new, long-lasting, forever wrestling fans, you kind of hit it. It's what's going on with Punk and Drew, and also Seth Rollins. Everything that's going on between those three is, I think, the best thing going on in professional wrestling at the moment, in my opinion. So if I'm finding wrestling now in 2024, I could see, 10 years down the line, me coming back and saying that it was Punk, Drew, and Rollins that made me fall in love with wrestling. Most people here are OG wrestling fans, so I'll answer as someone fairly new here. I didn't start fully watching until Royal Rumble of this year. This was the moment I fell in love. The final boss made me realize how much of this incredible sport has to offer. I, in a way, am jealous of you, but I also feel bad for you. Let me explain. I'm jealous of you because you got into wrestling when wrestling is at its absolute best. I'm also feeling bad for you because I have a hard time seeing how WWE can top what they did in those first 4 months of 2024. So it might be all downhill from here, folks. Honestly, I remember the match like it was yesterday, and it was Ray versus Eddie for the custody of Dominic. Such a wild match, but I loved it. It stuck in my head and looped some days. I mean, if you stuck with wrestling after the ridiculousness of that storyline, that feud, that match, then you're never gonna go away. You really are a forever wrestling fan, because I love this match, but this is as goofy and as crazy as wrestling has ever been. Like, the custody of a child just hanging up there. That's insane. My dad would turn on wrestling, and I love the New Day. When Big E and Woods won the gauntlet, I remember being so excited. This match was awesome. Genuinely stopped watching for a bit when Brock won it from Kofi. Yeah, the ending of all of this obviously isn't very good, with Brock Lesnar beating Kofi Kingston in just 5 seconds. I will still never forgive the WWE for that, but my God, the rise of Kofi Mania, dear Lord, it's one of the best things that WWE has done in the past 15 years, in my opinion. So yeah, if your dad has it on and you are by proxy witnessing everything that happened to the lead up of WrestleMania 35 and seeing Kofi Mania play out, God damn it, dude, that is absolutely such a great way to get into wrestling. All right, folks, thank you so much for submitting in your memories. This is the last video from the hotel room. This is the last video from traveling. Thank you very much for sticking with me, even though I'm not in front of my setup, not in the best of lighting. It does kind of look like a hostage video, not with the best of sounds, but we're getting through it and still giving you that daily wrestling content. But that's it. I'm out. Get out of here.